and welcome. And now we'll introduce the World Adaptation Science Program. Next slide, please. Good. So the mission of WASP is to make science work for adaptation. It focuses on, it's a worldwide program and network to focus on policy relevant scientific research and assessments, in particular, prioritizing research needs in vulnerable developing countries. There are three main activities of WASP. First of all, identifying the current research gaps, but also putting on our foresight hats and looking for future research gaps, and providing, this is and the session today is in particular about our the WASP third major activity is to provide policy relevant guidance. I want to introduce you briefly to the chair of WASP, Youssef Nassef, from the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. With me on the science committee are Anand Patwardhan, whom you'll be hearing from in a moment, Joanna Nailu. We work on bringing the science parts to fulfill the mission forward, and then Ming Peng on the policy and finance committee. So we're not separated. Science and policy are really intertwined within WASP. Min Peng Cheng from China and Bruce Curry Adler from Canada. So these are the leaders, and then there's a roster of WASP members who participate as well. Next, please. So just to delve a bit deeper into the core activities, one of the main activities of WASP is the Adaptation Futures Conference Series. And I would add right here, and I think we need to update the slide, because we also participate in Gobeshona every year. So we're so happy to be part of Gobeshona. You're going to see what's up with the Science for Adaptation Policy Briefs, and we develop adaptation research directions portfolio. Right now, we're developing core research projects for WASP. So stay tuned for some very exciting WASP emerging activities. But we also, of course, partnerships is the name of climate change right now. That partnerships of partnerships and networks of networks. So we have strong partnerships with the Adaptation Research Alliance and the Adaptation Gap Report. And at the bottom are listed our main UNs and other sponsoring agencies, so that I won't read out the alphabet soup, but you see it there on the slide, these main UN and other organizations, so that we can, through them and to connect with the wider adaptation researchers worldwide. Let's go on to the next slide. And here are the recent, we call them SAPBs. One was on decision support tools and platforms. One was very much inspired by the work of Richard Klein, transboundary climate risk and adaptation, high-end climate change and adaptation, very, very critical as the frequency and intensity of extreme events continues to grow. And the one that was the brief 4 was launched at COP26 in Glasgow, early warning systems for adaptation. But now let's turn our attention to the SAPB that we're launching today in the next slide. And it gives me great pleasure to officially launch it and to turn over the presentation to the author team leads. I'm going to introduce each of them briefly. I believe Catherine is going to speak first. So Dr. Catherine Bowen is a professor, deputy director at the Melbourne Climate Futures, and becoming a professor at the Melbourne School of Population and Health, and Global Health, University of Melbourne. She works at the nexus of global environmental change, global health, and governance issues, primarily in low and middle income settings. So it's was wonderful for her to take the co-lead of authoring this policy brief. The other presenter and Catherine's co-lead is Anand Patwardhan, who is a professor in the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland in College Park. He's been a professor in India and at Duke University in the US, and is out of Carnegie Mellon University in terms of his PhD. He's a member of the Scientific Advisory Panel for the Global Environmental Outlook, member of the Science Committee for WASP, and has interacted with IPCC, very intensively through the IPCC process. So with that, turn over to Catherine and Anand to present the risks of cascading climate shocks and stresses, the fifth WASP Science for Adaptation Policy Briefs. Over to you, Catherine.
Thank you, Cynthia, and thank you for that really helpful overview of WASP. And it's as I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners on whose land I'm coming from to you today. So I'm coming from the lands of the Bunurong people here in Victoria, in Australia, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And really, the issues of environmental change are so importantly linked to the ways that we understand and respect Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous ways of being. So it's a pleasure to be here this evening, my time, with my co-lead Anand. And so what we will do is just briefly provide a summary of the policy brief. And what I will commence with just now is a bit of an overview of what are cascading shocks and stresses and why are they important. So in this policy brief, we talk about three types of shocks and cascading shocks and stresses. So one is multiple hazardous events that occur in quick succession. So if I think about the example in my home country in Australia, in 2019, for example, this was the driest year on record. So we had a long period of drought. This was followed by the devastating Black Summer bushfires of 2019 and 2020. And then in the first half of 2020, we were also faced with floods. So this is an example of what we call the multiple hazardous events that occur in quick succession. And I know that some of our panelists will go into more detail on that as well. And I'll also present a little more detail around the Australian context that we're currently living through at the moment. But another example of cascading shocks and stresses is the types of linked impacts from climate change that we're seeing. So for example, coupled events linking to increased dryness and reduced precipitation or rainfall, and this can come in the form of heat waves and droughts. So that's really important to also understand, is that these events are linked, and it's often the case that we'll find in increased long-term drying and droughts, there'll also be an increase in heat waves as well. And the third is quite a complex look at cascading shocks and stresses, and that really points to the importance of understanding our systems as a whole. So this is really looking at negative impacts on the various systems. So for example, economic damages from a cyclone or from a drought, as examples of extreme weather events, and what this might do to economies that depend on, for example, a particular crop type. So if there's a cyclone or a drought that wipes out a crop in a particular area, there are going to be flow-on effects to other communities, and these are going to be economic, they're going to be social, they're going to be health, and other types of systems-based impacts. So it's really important that we understand these cascading shocks and stresses evident in multiple ways. And just to finish this sort of introduction is that with an increase in the intensity and frequency of extreme weather events that we know is projected by the IPCC, for example, and many other scientific assessments as well, we do expect to see these cascading effects to be more pronounced. So next slide, please, Kaisa. Thank you. So I just also wanted to present a couple of slides that have, I was involved in the 6th assessment report for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and with Aditi, who's on our panel, we were both involved in the summary for policymakers as well. So the 6th assessment report for Working Group 2, which looks at vulnerability, impact and adaptation, really was able to assess the literature around cascading and compounding events. So this slide is really helpful, I think, to understand in a bit more detail the links between them. So when multiple extreme events happen at the same time, they compound the overall risk and are more difficult to manage. And what we can see here is an example of how heat and drought combine, so as in my earlier example, to cause reductions in crop yields. And this is made worse by reduced productivity because of heat stress among farm workers. And these reduced yields lead to reductions in household incomes, increased food prices locally and potentially globally. So it's really important to understand that climate risks do not respect national boundaries, and weather-related extremes are creating shocks to global trade. So it's a really complex issue that we're dealing with. Next slide, please, Kaisa. And the second slide really on the IPCC particularly, I wanted to pull out some of the key statements that we were able to identify arising from the assessment. So there's many more in the assessment talking about complex, compound and cascading risks, but these were just a few, and they really bring home the issue of these risks and impacts. So we know that concurrent and repeated climate hazards occur in all regions, and they do increase the impacts and the risks to health, ecosystems, infrastructure, livelihoods and food. So it really is important that, as I said, we take a systems-based approach to understanding these issues. Another example provided by the IPCC in its assessment was that future sea level rise combined with storm surge and heavy rainfall will increase compound flood risks. And just finally, risks to health and food production will be made more severe from the interaction of sudden food production losses from heat and drought, exacerbated by heat-induced labour productivity losses. So these are important to keep in mind because we're now able to assess the literature on this issue. And you can see that all of these statements have a high confidence associated with them. So it really is an important area that we're needing to focus much more of our attention. So I wanted to just finish off my brief input on this before I hand over to Anand with what we're currently seeing in my home country of Australia. And to the north of us in northern New South Wales is an acute example of an extreme event that is compounding as we speak. So these floods that began ironically at the launch of the release of the Working Group 2 IPCC report at the end of February, these floods, unprecedented floods up in northern New South Wales, we've seen many deaths and injuries, and we're going to also see sort of indirect impacts for many, many days, months and years to come. And importantly, what we're understanding more and more about these events are the mental health implications of these extreme weather events. So this flooding event happened at the end of February. The communities have had a few weeks to recover, but just in the last 24, 48 hours, they've been faced with yet another massive rainfall event, so more flooding. So there's been very little time between each event for communities to recover and to be able to start rebuilding. So this is an issue that we're facing with these compounding and cascading impacts, is that they're reducing the amount of time that communities actually have to be able to gather themselves up again and be back in their communities and thrive. So this is an enormous challenge, as we know that these extreme weather events will increase in their frequency and their severity. So with that, I'll pass on to Anand.
Thanks very much, Catherine, and a very good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone here. It's a pleasure to be here at this WASP event, and it's been wonderful working with Catherine and the author team on putting together this Science for Adaptation Policy Brief. I think what the examples that Catherine mentioned, and also the key messages coming from the IPCC AR6 Working Group 2 report, highlight some of the reasons why cascading impacts pose such challenges from a response perspective. Right? So there is a few characteristics, one of them being persistence. That is, as impacts persist, they tend to then lead to through part dependency, potentially depressed growth trajectories. So these impacts persist well beyond just the event itself. So that notion of persistence, the notion of complexity, which is that impacts are not localized or limited to one sector or one region, but that through social, economic, or other connections are able to then transmit and affect more broadly other sectors or other regions, or even indeed sometimes entire economies of countries, as this Madagascar example illustrates, which is that you had a severe famine that resulted from persistent long-term drought. And that famine then in turn led to shocks through the broader economy, and indeed the entire agricultural sector, which then leads to depressed incomes. It leads to worsening of poverty traps, where farmers are unable to become both food insecure as well as livelihood insecure. And then that in turn would cascades and affects longer term growth and development trajectories. So the idea that these cascades can lead to persistent, longer term and larger scale consequences, not limited to the individual event itself. The Science for Policy Brief also talks a little bit about the example, well-known example from Thailand, where essentially devastating floods in one country can affect global supply chains because of the interconnectedness of world trade and the interconnectedness of global manufacturing. And indeed, again, those supply chains, precisely as they were created to lead to more efficiency and larger scale production, also in turn serve as the vehicles to transmit risks across systemic, regional, or other boundaries. Next slide, please. So just to sort of wrap a few key ideas from this policy brief, again, as Cynthia mentioned in her opening remarks, the intention, WASP's intention behind these Science for Adaptation policy briefs is to communicate sort of key emerging areas of knowledge to the policy community in a way that makes them accessible and also helps underpin their implications for policy and for response. So we can sort of group the key messages from this SAPB into two broad categories. There's some key messages around the nature of risks. And I think this again echoes what Catherine just talked about as coming out of the IPCC report, that these cascades can lead to amplification. Not only are risks being transmitted across boundaries, but they're also in that process potentially being amplified. So what might have be seen as initially a localized impact of a particular event that affects only a few communities or a smaller region leads in turn to consequences that are much broader and larger in scope and magnitude. So the notion of amplification. The notion also that when you have cascading risks and the possibility of persistence and then path dependency and lock-in, you are left with a much smaller window of action to build back. Because if you had repeated, again, this was a point that was made earlier, if you had repeated shocks to a system, if you do not have as much time to build back to a point where you are able to avoid getting locked into a depressed trajectory. So again, the notion that these are making the response much more challenging because of the reduced window of time, that these impacts then, and this is again very well known and has been brought out quite nicely in the AR6, is on whom these impacts fall. They fall on those that are already at risk due to other stressors. And then fundamentally, these cascades and the idea of complex and interconnected risks make them harder to project and act upon. And that's precisely the challenges from a response perspective that I'd like to touch upon in the last slide. Next, please. Is why does this matter? Why is this a much greater challenge for policy than we had before? Fundamentally, responding to these cascading risks requires a much stronger degree of interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary collaboration. As was mentioned, risks are not limited to a particular sector. Health risks may lead to larger economic consequences, may require very different kinds of approaches in terms of figuring out both what the risk is and how one responds to it. So that, and that's hard. Responses are often driven by sector silos and regional governance. But in fact, the whole idea of cascading shocks is that we have to now cross some of those sector or scale boundaries, which is fundamentally a challenging prospect, precisely because how policy is often organized precisely around those sectoral and regional boundaries. A second policy implication is that indeed the distributional consequences of cascades mean that a focus on equity and justice is essential for effective response. Right. So governance is an issue, especially governance, again, as I said, that has to transcend scales and sectors and lead to collective decision making at those scales. And then we run into two of the more classic challenges for adaptation that already exist. Firstly, the challenge of adaptation finance and the need to devolve that finance to support action on the ground. This is a long-standing issue, of course, not limited just to cascading shocks and stresses. And then finally, I think it highlights that if we wanted to respond effectively, we need to use all the tools at our disposal, which means even as we, for example, think and grapple with the pandemic and the after effects of that pandemic, which have included, for example, migration in many countries, we need to make that response in a way that builds capacity and resilience for the long term. And again, this linkage on the response side, so just as we see connections on the problem space in terms of the connection between risks, we also see potential connections that need to be exploited on the response side, which is looking for synergies across different policy domains and policy objectives. So with that, I'd like to conclude this little introduction overview of the Science for Adaptation Policy Brief that was just launched today. I'm sure there'll be lots of very interesting perspectives coming in from our panelists. Very keen to hear those. And then, of course, with the contributions from the participants. So with that, let me turn back to Cynthia. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine and Anand. Now it is officially launched, and we turn to our panel discussion and Q&A parts of our session. We have a wonderful panel assembled. I'm going to introduce each of them briefly, and then each of them will have up to 5 minutes to present their responses to the policy brief, linking it to their current work and the communities of practice that they interact with. First is Claire Leopold, who is a research fellow at the Melbourne School of Population and Global Health at University of Melbourne. And she is just starting a project, or is in the midst of a project on disasters, in which it's focused on helping communities respond and develop resilience to these cascading climate shocks and stressors. That's absolutely no small set of challenges. Then the next panelist is Aditi Mukherjee, who led the water and air theme at ICIMAD in Nepal, and now is a principal researcher at the International Water Management Institute, IMI. And as was mentioned by Catherine, she was the coordinating lead author of the water chapter in the IPCC Working Group 2 6th assessment report, which just came out just about a month ago. Welcome Aditi and Claire. And our third panelist is Dr. Ziti Sebesvari. She is the Deputy Director of the UNU Institute for Environment and Human Security, and she continues to head the UNU EHS academic section on environmental vulnerability and ecosystem services. And in a very germane activity, she's leading the UNU's flagship report on interconnected disaster risks, very much linked to the topic of the newly launched SAPB that we're discussing today. Finally, last but not least, Richard Klein from the Stockholm Environment Institute in Bonn has more than 25 years of experience in original research, science assessment, policy advice. He has been lead author or coordinating lead author on 6 IPCC reports, co-directed the Nordic Center of Excellence for Strategic Adaptation Research, founded the journal Climate and Development, and was the co-chair of the science committee that we're working on carrying on your legacy, Richard, from 2018 and 2020, and also received the Bertoni Award in the field of climate impacts and adaptation. That's a high honor indeed. So Richard, so that completes our panel. We'll start with Claire with your 5 minutes each, please. And I'll come on, I'm going to set my timer, and I will come on and tell you when we are approaching your 5 minutes. Thanks so much. Over to you, Claire.
Thanks, Cynthia, for the introduction, and hi, everyone. I just want to say to start that this is really such an important policy brief, and I'm really glad to see it published at this time. As Catherine said, I'm based in Australia as well, and we currently have really catastrophic flooding up in northern New South Wales. A lot of these communities which I'm working in did experience the 2019-2020 Black Summer bushfires, followed by really intense flooding last month, and then again, really intense flooding this month. So really seeing this play out in the communities I'm working in and seeing the real impacts that this is having. So this policy brief really is underscoring the need for engagement from all stakeholders to address cascading risks. And I think it's being released at a time that's extremely relevant locally here in Australia, but also globally. The main point that I can make is really from working in public health. I can mostly speak to a health and well-being perspective. I recently worked on a review that has now been published in the Lancet Public Health, where we reviewed all international evidence that we could identify on the public health implications of multiple disaster exposures. So what happens when people and communities are experiencing multiple disasters? This is an important question because actually when you look at disaster research, a lot of it is premised on a single disaster occurring, and a lot of the resources and policy frameworks out there are also based on that single disaster premise, but we're seeing more and more that communities are facing multiple disasters. So we conducted this review trying to source the evidence that was out there. And one thing that we did find was that the mental health risks associated with experiencing multiple disasters went above and beyond what we typically see after a single disaster. For example, multiple disaster exposures were associated with increased risk of suicide attempts, depression, and post-traumatic stress compared to risks from a single disaster exposure. So I think this really drives home the message that we cannot forget about the potential health effects of experiencing these types of cascading events, as highlighted in this policy brief. And we really need to work to find ways to minimize these health risks as much as possible. This Lancet review also found that there's a real need for more research still on how experiencing multiple disasters can affect people's risk perception, evacuation behaviors, and recovery experiences. This is something where there's still really mixed and developing evidence so far, and we know there's a need for more. So this is something that I think we really need to continue working on in parallel with work on adaptation, as highlighted in this brief. But overall, really good to see this published at such a timely moment. Back to you, Cynthia.
Thank you, Claire. Aditi, to you, please.
Thank you to the organizers, and thank you, Catherine and Anand, for a really interesting policy brief and very timely, as Claire rightly said. Even in the working group 2 report of AR6, we did find that these cascading and compound events are on the rise, and we know most of us who work on climate change adaptation and in all our respective countries, we do see these compound and cascading events affecting communities, particularly those communities who are most exposed to climate, how do I say, climate sensitive activities, for example, agriculture. Therefore, I mean, everything that's there in the report is, I think, very timely and very important. And I wanted to relate some of these findings with our latest IPCC report that Catherine presented parts of it today. I thought that one of the interesting things, and that I feel, well, I come from the water community, and so obviously I'm biased, but I feel that we do not talk enough, is that the origin or many of these climate hazards are actually water related. And when it comes to these sectors which are more exposed to, which are kind of climate sensitive sectors such as farming, agriculture, the reality is that majority of our farmers experience their first brush with climate change is through changes in the precipitation regime. That's how they experience climate change. And our review of literature, the assessment that we did for the AR6, GAMI plus something additional was also done by the water chapter, which I led, also shows that almost 60% of all adaptation interventions are in one way or the other in response to either the hazard being water related, by that I mean floods, droughts, precipitation variability, melting of cryosphere, groundwater issues, water quality issues. So either the adaptation, 60% of adaptation, 60% or more adaptation were occurring either because of water related hazards, or the adaptation itself was water related. So a whole lot of adaptation that we find currently in practice have a big water component, be it irrigation, rainwater harvesting, the soil moisture conservation in the urban areas, things like planning for floods, I mean, a host of it. So I feel that there is a huge role that water can play in planning adaptation. So in some ways, and this is not an original statement, this has been made time and again, that what carbon is to mitigation, water needs to be that to adaptation. And I feel that there's and that comes, I mean, floods and droughts are at the end of the day water related ones. So, and then, so that's basically a kind of centrality of water in a lot of the adaptation action that we are seeing in the frontline communities is important to understand, and accordingly invest both in research, but as well as implementation. The second important part that again is a part of our working group 2 chapter and the report as a whole is that we found that there is a host of adaptation that is going on, water being a component of it, but even otherwise. And there are a whole lot of benefits to adaptation. What is in fact is not clear, and part of it could be actually deficit of literature or not enough rigorous studies. What is not very clear is whether those adaptation are actually reducing current climate risk. And I feel that that's an important knowledge gap, something that perhaps WASP can invest in, and all of us who are working on adaptation, and especially in preparation for the next assessment cycle. Are adaptation interventions effective in reducing climate risk? And that is where I think the literature gets really patchy, because there isn't enough that does that kind of causal analysis and links adaptation with actual risk reduction on the ground. While it's clear, this is not to say that adaptation hasn't got benefits. I mean, benefits are very clear for everybody to see. I think linking that benefits of adaptation to actual risk reduction to climate change, that is whether the risk reduction in terms of reduction in vulnerability, exposure is actually reduced, is something I think we still need to generate that kind of evidence effectively. Related to this, my third point is, irrespective of whether or not the literature is robust enough to describe effectiveness of current adaptation, what we did find with high confidence, particularly in the water chapter, is whatever effectiveness of adaptation is happening now would almost certainly reduce at a higher level of warming. So up to 1.5 degree, we were still seeing that many of the current adaptation, and if I remember right, we had some 9 or so adaptation responses for which we had enough literature to look into the future adaptation scenarios. And we saw that majority of them would remain effective up to 1.5%, but 1.5 degree, but beyond 1.5 degree, effectiveness of adaptation also declines. And this becomes particularly important in the scenario of cascading and compound events. So I think those are the two knowledge gaps that we thought are important for our scientific community to work on. Yeah, thank you. Apologies if I took more time. Back to you,
No,
Cynthia.
Just perfect timing. Thank you so much, Aditi. And now over to Zita Sebasvari from UNU. Zita, please.
Thank you very much, Cynthia. And I would like to echo the previous speaker. So this is a very, very timely policy brief. And I feel that this topic and the urgency of this topic creates a lot of ripples also in conversations with the public and with media. So I'm talking from the perspective of the Interconnected Disaster Risk Report, which we published last year in September, and it's set out as an annual report. So that is the first one. We are currently working on the second, and the idea was to look into 10 events which happened in the previous year, which were major events and kind of emblematic for certain deeper issues, so related to climate change, biodiversity, but also challenges around adaptation and disaster risk reduction. So for our events in 2020, the main focus was to look into interconnectivities, and interconnectivities on several levels, so in terms of the root causes, the drivers, but also how the different events interact with each other and cause ripple effects and cascading impacts. So very much in line with the policy brief here at hand. And so it's a scientific report, but written for the public. So very much with this communication lens, how can we actually communicate for the wider public that those distance events happening in the Amazon or happening in Vietnam or happening in Bangladesh has a wider impact globally, and they will, so to say, also influence everyone's life everywhere on the planet, and embracing this message that every action matters. So the messages are quite similar, and I would say one of the prime examples was COVID-19, because we really could show that most of the events we looked at in one way or the other interacted with the impacts of COVID-19 or with our responses which we employed in face of COVID-19. So if you are thinking about the cyclone Amphan, which hit the coast at the border region of India and Bangladesh, or if you are thinking about the cold wave in Texas in the US. So all of that interacted with the COVID-19 pandemic, and you could really see these ripple effects everywhere. Our report also recognized that so the risks are interconnected, but so are also the solutions. So whenever we are looking into solutions, we need to look into this deeper interconnectivity, and in ideal case, address with our solutions those interconnectivity to avoid trade-offs and missing out, so to say, the point. At the same time, we also see that our responses really need to factor in these increasing uncertainties and hardly predictable outcomes and surprises. And when I'm looking at your policy brief, I was thinking, what does it mean actually for local decision makers? What does it mean for making good decisions for adaptation and risk reduction? So what I think is that factoring in uncertainties and surprises often means actually to work with redundancy and with more diversification. So if you look into one of your examples on the Thailand supply chain, for example, so redundancy helps to build resiliency by, for example, building up buffers for supplies, building up stocks, and to have emergency cover when disasters strike. Diversification helps to have different sources and alternative ways to respond if needed. And I feel there's an important consideration which I would like to raise here for discussion. So I think redundancy and diversification are usually not working very well with cost-benefit approaches, with cost effectiveness. So if you think about this focus on cost effectiveness was one of the reasons why in some places we do not have enough stocks or enough buffers of medical equipment before the pandemic strikes. Or you could also, if you simplify, you could say that it's cost effectiveness which led to forest loss in many places where we have now monocultures. So I just would like to raise this issue that they are not working very well together. And if we are calling in the policy brief for more financial resources for locally led resilience activities, it would be good to also give some advice how to steer the conversation about decision making for building resilience and to deal with this. I would say there's a primacy of cost effectiveness, cost benefit argumentations for decision makings on the ground, and that might not always serve our desired outcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Zita. Richard, over to you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Cynthia, and thanks Anand and Catherine for a fantastic policy brief. I would like to reflect on cascading risk from a cross-border transboundary perspective, and also emphasize the importance of what is called just resilience. This is a term which was introduced by the Director General for Climate Action of the European Commission in last year's EU adaptation strategy. And the idea behind it is that it's not only important to build resilience to cascading risk or any kind of risk really, but also to consider the potential winners and losers. So not only resilience, but also how you build resilience. And that aspect of justice and equity, I think, is particularly important when you start looking at cascading climate risks, because interventions to reduce these climate risks could have the effect not necessarily of reducing the risk, but shifting the risk to someone else. Let me just give an example from a transboundary perspective of what I mean with that. In 2008, 2009, there were a number of geopolitical developments that created some tension on the world markets of food commodities and energy, and among other things. And a drought in South and Southeast Asia, as well as in Russia and the Ukraine, led to some panic and immediate action by some of the countries, including India, for example, which imposed an export ban for rice, which was sort of a rational decision from an Indian perspective, to make sure that its food security would be maintained. But it had the knock-on effect, or a cascading effect, of creating a spike in the price of rice in the world market, which of course then also affected other parts of the world, including importing regions such as West Africa. And we looked at Senegal, where in 2008 there were food riots, and leading to political instability and people in the riots dying in the streets of Dakar. And when you start looking at this idea that there is, basically a situation like we are having at the moment, where there is tension on the food market, action is being taken in response to a climate event, a drought in this case, which then has inadvertent effects harming other people. It's important to consider that adaptation, just like climate change, but also adaptation, can have winners and losers. And that, similar to the discussion that's going on about just transition in mitigation, where there is awareness that climate policy can lead to loss of livelihoods of people working in the fossil fuel sector, for example, the same can happen as a result of adaptation. Another example would be smallholder coffee farmers in Brazil, for example, who through a very complex supply chain deliver their coffee to, for example, Europe. And there are contracts of the coffee importers with traders who then get their coffee from the smallholder farmers. If for whatever reason, for example, climate change, the quality or quantity of that coffee is no longer that which was contractually agreed, it's very easy and perhaps rational for a coffee importer in Europe to cancel the contracts. But that means that the coffee farmer in Brazil will have to face not only the risk of climate change, but also that of the action of others to deal with that climate change. And I think it's an important element to consider when we talk about cascading risks, that yes, it's important to be aware of cascading risks. It's important to to understand better what the options are to reduce cascading climate risk. But we also need to consider what that means from a governance perspective. Whose job is it to take action to reduce the climate risk? In the Senegal example, should India have done something differently? Should Senegal have prepared for a situation like that? Is this a job for the World Food Programme or the World Bank or the European Commission? And what are the consequences of the actions taken by one or the other? And that's an element that I would very much like to see perhaps in the following policy brief of WASP. But yeah, I think it's a first step to talk about the complexity of climate risk. It's a next step to talk about the complexity of adaptation governance that follows from that. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you to all panelists. So if all the panelists could turn on their cameras, if you have enough bandwidth, and and also Anand and Catherine, and also for our participants, please do post in the chat any of your questions directed to one or more of the panelists, or a general question or a general comment, so that we're now going to have a discussion period. So I'm going to lead off, and actually following on from exactly what Richard was, the question that he posed, whose job is it? And how can we as researchers encourage governance, both at local, as Zita mentioned, and national scales, as Richard mentioned, to create the kind of trans-sector work that really needs to be done to create just resilience. So, let's roll up our sleeves a little bit now in the panel discussion. Okay, it's a great brief explaining the complexities. How do we now go forward? So could panelists jump in, and Anand and Catherine, maybe turning to you first, Anand and Catherine, what are your thoughts on, as Richard is challenging us, where do we go next in terms
I'm
of
happy to
helping
start.
make this happen?
Yeah, I'm happy to just start briefly, but I think that what this calls for is, again, looking at a place-based approach. So working with communities, co-designing solutions that are led by communities, and respecting the understanding, the Indigenous knowledge, the local knowledge that comes out of all of our communities, so that we can really get to the solutions that will work for particular contexts, because we know that not one solution will fit all challenges. So it's really important that it's a consultative approach, and we raised this in the AR6 and the IPCC, the absolute importance of inclusive participation in governance processes and in decision making. So I think that it's understanding some of the guiding principles to develop these solutions is fundamental for an effective way forward. So no longer can we take these top-down approaches that governments are so good at doing. It's really changing the way we work. And as researchers, we need to get much better at communicating our research effectively. So this necessitates us to have much closer links with the communities that we might be keen to work with. So it's about making sure that the research that we do can be clearly understood, but it's also allows us an opportunity to work with communities to co-design research that they see as important and a priority for their own setting. So there are a couple of reflections from me, and perhaps Anand, over to you then.
Anand, over to you. What are your thoughts?
Yes, thanks,
How?
Catherine. So just a couple of things. First, I think I want to pick up a point that Richard mentioned, which I think is really important. It goes kind of to the subject of the research, which is, are we investing enough on understanding, for example, the distributional consequences, right? So when you talk about just resilience, we need to first build the analytical understanding of, okay, what are the distributional consequences? What are the linkages of actions taken by one country or by one actor, and kind of what do they lead to in terms of consequences for others? So that's sort of the whole notion of distributional consequences is not something that's often the focus of study. But then I think, as Catherine said, the challenge is to do that requires a shift, I think, in the way we do research, right? So it's not enough then for us to say, okay, we'll do our own sort of study in our own particular context and be satisfied with that, because then we are really calling then for a slightly different research enterprise that's much more able to bridge some of these sort of both silos at scale, but then also silos across sectors. And Aditi made an interesting point about kind of water being a natural connector, if you will. But that, that what that also means is there's very different sets of disciplines and individuals engaging with water, but they need to be then kind of, in a sense, brought together. So I think it does call for a shift in the way we do research, and then which also means calls for a shift in the way we fund research potentially, because without the kind of funding and the structures that otherwise act as barriers to, say, transdisciplinary work, you can't make a whole lot of progress. Thanks, Cynthia.
Great. Thank you. Other panelists, anyone would like to jump in on helping to answer this? How do we do it? What do we need to do? And we're, decade of action on climate change. This is no longer just kind of idle. I see Richard and Zita. Richard, let's start with you and Zita, and then Aditi, and then we have a challenging question from in the Q&A, so we'll go to that next. But Richard, please.
Yeah, thanks. I hear what you're saying, Catherine, that place-based and local is important. It absolutely is. But at the same time, I don't think you can leave it to communities to understand the intricacies and complexities of global markets, for example. I think it also comes down to what the Paris Agreement says, that adaptation is a global challenge. I think I'm absolutely convinced it needs to come from both ways. It's important to empower communities, but I think saying, well, this is basically community's job and we need to co-design it also can be very disempowering, because many of the changes that we are facing and that are impacting and causing these cascading risks are not in the realm of control of communities. So I'm arguing that we need to really work both from a bottom up and a top down perspective, where perhaps the UNFCCC has an important role to play and develop coalitions that go beyond the typical north-south dynamic that we're seeing when we talk about adaptation in global policy. And of course, also that needs to happen within countries and within communities. But some of these processes, whether it's a virus that crosses borders or whether it's a climate risk that crosses borders, I think it could be quite disempowering to say, well, communities will have to address this and need to take the initiative.
Great, thank you. Zita, please. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I am thinking a bit in a similar vein. So I think maybe for adaptation, there are also some lessons we can learn from the biodiversity discussion, because biodiversity is meant to be also very locally specific and actions need to be taken locally. But at the same time, the framework, so to say, is driven by global environmental change and climate change. So there is just so much a local ecosystem can do in terms of adaptive capacity. If we are talking about coral reefs, where the IPCC notes that with 1.5 degree, they are under serious threat, and with 2 degree, they are basically lost. And then we can do whatever we want locally, but the global conditions are such that it's constrained. So that just maybe this thinking also on the biodiversity crisis, and the IPBES is also kind of working towards these crossing this boundaries since years now. So I think the adaptation discourse can also join in a way. There are many similarities which I would highlight here.
Great, thank you, Zita. And Aditi, your thoughts on some of this is about bottom up and top down.
Yeah, I also wanted to actually touch upon and relate my question, my comments to the question that Ashish has asked on the Q&A. I think for the adaptation community, one of the things we are finding very clearly in the IPCC report is that the effectiveness of adaptation at higher levels of global warming goes down considerably. And we have to remember that not all adaptation can be modeled, because how do you model things like migration and all of that? But whatever can be modeled, evidence is clear that effectiveness goes down. So I do feel that we have to think of adaptation and mitigation hand in hand. There is no, basically how constrained you become with adaptation beyond a certain degree. And I feel that still we do have these divide between who does mitigation, who does adaptation, and adaptation people are often not in the room when mitigation are being planned. So I think that unless we kind of synergize between adaptation and mitigation, and that's exactly the kind of question that Ashish is asking. I mean, there is this question of remaining carbon budget and who gets to use that remaining carbon budget to do what. I mean, we have to ask those questions, and the adaptation community cannot simply work within the comfort of adaptation itself, whether locally, top down, bottom up. I mean, there has to be much more synergies with mitigation and ask those more relevant ethical questions around who gets to use the remaining carbon budget, if at all. And yeah, I mean, that's what was my thinking around. But with that, I do also agree with Richard that it can't be just the job of the communities. It has to be both bottom up and top down. But my addition is that in addition to that, mitigation and adaptation people have to be in the same room at the same time.
Right, great.
Yeah.
Thank you, Aditi. Yes, and looping in, responding to Ashish's question in the Q&A, and Richard has said that he'd like to comment on this as well.
That was actually, I wasn't sure what that button was for, so I pressed it, and now I'm on the spot. But that's fine. I do have an opinion about it. I think, first of all, like Aditi says, I think it's absolutely important to mitigate as well as adapt to climate change. Without mitigation, adaptation will be much less effective, and there will be limits to adaptation, which means we'll simply will not be able to address the risks and impacts that we're facing. At the same time, though, to link it to degrowth as the only option, I find that a difficult conversation. Degrowth as sort of an objective. I would argue that, yes, I mean, we need to move away from excessive consumerism and wasteful growth. The resource intensive way of raising our GDP. At the same time, I also find it difficult to talk to African friends and say, well, actually we all need to degrowth when there are still so many people living in poverty. And I think, we need to be able as a research community and as a policy community to address multiple objectives at one. And one is to lift people out of poverty and to ensure development of the countries that have not yet reached the same status as in Europe, for example. At the same time, I think we should also question, is it really necessary to have a new phone every 2 years or to have 3 cars in the driveway, right? I mean, there is certainly, I think it is absolutely fair to question growth, but to see degrowth sort of as a global imperative as the only solution to reduce emissions, I find that going a bit too far.
Well, we really are at the top or just past the top of our hour. What I'm going to do is ask everyone to give just a brief 30-second final thought. I'm going to turn to Anand first because I think he was raising his hand. And everyone also do check the chat. But this has been, I think, a wonderful discussion. So final thoughts, and then I'll do a very brief wrap up. Anand, why don't you start?
Yeah, that's fine. Thanks, Cynthia. So I think Aditi has actually given the response that I was going to give in the chat, that where to whom does this degrowth narrative apply? I think that is really I think it's really about distribution of where the responsibility and where the response lies in terms of action on mitigation. But I just wanted to touch a little bit on what Richard mentioned in response to Ashish, and then conclude. I think part of the challenge is that we have still not seen. So yes, indeed, mitigation can be considered as the best form of adaptation, right? So the more we mitigate, the easier in some ways the challenge becomes. But I think at the same time, and this something goes back to what the IPCC AR5 and even before tried to emphasize, the notion of adaptation as sort of risk management. And so if you think about risk from a risk perspective, I think the challenge is not so much for us to figure out the feasibility or what to do at 1.5 degrees. The challenge really is to figure out what we might do differently today to prepare for 2.5 degrees or 3 degrees, right? So it's really, I think, incumbent in some ways on the adaptation community to help develop a much richer understanding of responses from a risk perspective to a higher potential level of warming, even as we work towards avoiding that scenario, right? So that's kind of what prudence in a way dictates. But what that also means is then the kind of information we need is much more fine-grained. It needs much more in terms of what some of these interconnections might be. And in particular, I think the one point that has come up a little bit in the discussion today, which I want to close with, is the whole issue of collective action. Right? So we have understood collective action in the context of mitigation. We have recognized, for example, that actions are needed by state actors, by non-state actors. There's a degree of coordination. There's questions of distribution and equity and justice that need to be addressed in that collective action. That collective action often has to cross scales. So it's action at the global has to connect with action at the local. But adaptation, I don't think we have really reached that point of trying to figure out, okay, what does it mean to do collective action that enables us to bridge response across scales? Where does the responsibility lie? I think we had a good conversation around how the local and the global connect to each other. That's precisely, I think, where the crux is as to how do we enable this collective action to work across scales, and what are the institutions, what are the mechanisms that allow for that to happen. So again, fascinating conversation, much food for thought, and I hope we can pick some of these ideas up in future work by WASP and by other adaptation research programs like the ARA. Thanks, Cynthia.
Thank you, Anand. All right, panelists, 30 seconds. I'm just going to start with Claire. What's your final thought?
I really see the importance of this policy brief coming out now, and I think it represents a call to action in its most core form. And I've heard that loudly as a researcher in terms of us doing better as researchers, but also in informing policy and bridging the top-down and bottom-up approaches to find something that works best for everyone. And so that's what I'll be thinking about going forward from this.
Thank you, Claire. Zita, please.
Thank you very much. I see also this is a very timely policy brief, and there will be a lot of conversations and there will be a lot of push towards channeling more finances towards adaptation. And in an ideal case, the research community prepares with better answers what is important in adaptation and how we can actually inform decision makers where to put the money, which is hopefully then coming and will be available for adaptation action. Thank you.
Thank you, Zita. Richard, please.
Thank you. One comment I'd like to make is that we need to stop pretending that climate risks are things that happen sometime in the future. They're already happening now. We have the war in the Ukraine, which is already leading to food scarcity in many places. The harvests of this year are going to be unknown if they're going to be exported. If at the same time we happen to have a drought in Canada, for example, or in the US, that situation is only going to be a lot worse, and that won't just have an effect on the region around Ukraine. We need to be much more alert and more urgent in developing responses, both in global policy as well as at the national level. And I'd also like to make a small plug that if you're interested in the transboundary climate risk and the justice elements of it, go to adaptationwithoutborders.org. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Richard, and for leading the way on transboundary risks and adaptation. Aditi, please, your final thought. And Catherine, you're going to get the last word of the panelists.
Thank you. My final thought was, I thought as researchers, as a climate change adaptation community, perhaps there is a need to improve improve our own tools and methods that we have. One of the big glaring gap that we found during the sixth assessment report was this whole literature of how effective adaptation is in reducing climate risk. That's a big knowledge gap, and how do we actually work going forward so that the scientists who are involved in the AR7 do not again come back saying that we still don't know. So I thought that is where, if we can focus on the next 7 years in honing tools and methods to improve our understanding of how to define effectiveness, how to measure effectiveness, that could be something to take forward. And in that, of course, methodology should also include things like compound and cascading risk, about which we know so much already. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Aditi. Catherine, you're the last one from the panelists, then I'll just say a few words to wrap up.
Thank you, Cynthia, and massive thanks from my side for all the panelists' participation in this session too. I'd like to take a step back, I suppose, in my final reflections and just think about the importance of our own values as individuals and communities in relation to how we're actually going to make these urgent and rapid transformations that we need. So what is it about what we value and what we see as our purpose as individuals, and then as part of members of our communities? And our communities can mean our local neighbourhoods, but they can also mean our communities of decision makers as well, at all scales of governance. So what is it about our values, and how can we ensure that these values that we hold dear to us push us in our work so that we can progress with the urgency that's needed to deal with this current challenge?
Thank you, Catherine. Well, thank you so much to first Anand and Catherine for leading the great effort on the WASP Science for Adaptation Policy Brief, which is on cascading shocks and stressors, which is now officially launched. Thank you so much. And I think we saw from the discussion how timely it is, coming right on the heels of the IPCC Working Group 2 work on this, but really helping to focus and really hone in and take the IPCC work even forward in very clear and communicative ways to decision makers. And I'm sure Martin, who is great, Martin and Keza, also thank you so much for organizing it and for making that policy brief happen. Just to say, we really did, I think, have a very meaningful conversation. One is the importance of I'm just going to highlight the importance of always the concept of just resilience, the linkage of mitigation and adaptation, but with the important caveat of the degrowth discussion that we had, and the North and South, a very different modus operandi for that degrowth and responsibility for the degrowth in the global North. The need for collective action for adaptation across scales. And Catherine just gave such a wonderful reminder to us all that the original first fundamental scale is our own values as individuals, all the way up from local to national to global. So thank you, Catherine, for that very, very important reminder. And then in terms of timescales, the importance of, as Richard said, focusing on risk management of cascading risks and stresses and shocks today. No more into the future that, eyes glazing over at the end of the century. Of course, still important that we learn about that, but that we need to focus on absolutely what's happening today. And finally, then for WASP, new ways of doing research that Aditi was really challenging us to do. This very key question on really unknowns and gap of the effectiveness of all these strategies that countries and communities are trying. How effective are they? And as Anand is calling to, this new ways of doing, and of course, funding research, which is something else that WASP will help on. So we look forward very much from the WASP community, Martin and Keza, the other co-chairs, and all the members of WASP, and this growing network of that we really want WASP to help to support the researchers worldwide to take on these challenges from the research side, providing the key knowledge base so that we really can create the just resilience to cascading shocks and stresses. So thanks everyone for a wonderful session. And it's recorded. So there's, even though perhaps participation was a bit small this morning, evening, afternoon, but this will be on the, I believe, on the web. And I think the discussion is very, very worthy of much wider tuning in, and will now be available. So thanks so much. Thanks to all. Thanks, and thanks for the organizers again.